In the unsettled years after the Civil War, when the wounds of the nation were still fresh and bleeding, the Kansas frontier became a land of both promise and peril. Homesteaders moved west with hope in their hearts and plows in their hands. But so too came raiders, rustlers, and the embers of old hatred that refused to die. In this uncertain time, in a patch of prairie near the Kansas-Missouri border, a preacher stepped up, not just to save souls, but to save lives. His name was Moses Speer, and this is the story of the preacher's rifle, the war that never really ended. Moses Speer wasn't a soldier during the Civil War, at least not officially. Born in Ohio in the late 1830s to a deeply religious family, he had been educated in both scripture and letters. He took up the ministry in his 20s and moved to eastern Kansas just before the war broke out. Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas, had already been drenched in blood from the fight over slavery. Long before official war broke out, the Kansas Territory had been a battleground between abolitionist settlers and pro-slavery militias. Moses, a firm abolitionist, knew exactly what kind of powder keg he was stepping into when he brought his wife and two small children to the area in 1859. By the war's end in 1865, Moses's church was still standing, but much of the countryside wasn't. The towns were scarred by raids from Confederate bushwhackers, many of whom refused to surrender even after Appomattox. Freedmen, newly emancipated black families, arrived in Kansas seeking land and liberty, only to be met with fresh violence. Gangs rode at night, setting fires, tearing down fences, and killing to reclaim a past that had been lost. And that's when Moses made his decision. A Bible in one hand, a rifle in the other. The church Moses Speer built was small, barely room for 30 people, but it stood on a rise overlooking the new settlement. Every Sunday, Moses would mount the pulpit in a long black coat, eyes lit with righteous fire. And beside him, leaned up against the pulpit, was a worn, lever-action rifle. It wasn't for show. Moses wasn't just preaching the gospel, he was protecting his congregation. Many of them were black families newly freed, and others were German and Irish immigrants, new to farming and unfamiliar with violence. But Moses had seen too much to let them stand alone. When night riders came near, Moses didn't wait for them to act. He organized the men of his church into a night watch. He taught them how to shoot, how to move quietly, how to reinforce their homes. He wrote to former Union officers, acquiring surplus rifles and ammunition. When raiders came, they were met not by frightened settlers, but by an armed, coordinated resistance, led by a preacher. The battle at Blue Creek. The most famous incident came in 1868 near Blue Creek, just a few miles from Moses's church. A group of Missouri bushwhackers, bitter veterans who refused to surrender, crossed the border with a plan to burn out several black farms. They underestimated the preacher. Moses and 6 others, including a freedman named Elijah Carter and a young German farmer, ambushed the raiders as they approached the creek ford. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 3 raiders lay dead, 2 fled, and 1 was captured. No settlers were hurt. Moses didn't gloat. He simply delivered the wounded raider to the sheriff in the nearby town of Humboldt and returned to his pulpit the next Sunday. That day, the church was packed to standing room. His sermon? "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." The weight of righteous violence. Not everyone agreed with Moses's methods. Some neighboring towns saw him as dangerous, mixing the sacred and the violent. But those who lived under his protection called him a guardian. Moses himself wrestled with it. In his journals, discovered decades later in a family attic, he wrote, "A man of God must walk softly, yet carry the strength to shelter his flock. I do not seek the fight, but I will not allow wolves to feast unchecked." He understood what many frontier leaders came to learn. Law was slow, justice uncertain, and sometimes survival depended on whether or not you stood up before the knock came on your door. As Kansas grew and stabilized, Moses Speer faded from the headlines. He passed away in 1897, buried behind his old church. His grave is simple, just a weather-worn stone marked with his name, a cross, and a verse from Isaiah. "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks." But for those who know frontier history, Moses Speer was more than a preacher. He was part of a generation of quiet warriors. Men and women who stood between chaos and community, not with fame or bravado, but with courage and a steady hand. The preacher's rifle today, the old rifle that stood beside Moses's pulpit, is believed to be in a small regional museum near Parsons, Kansas. Its stock is cracked, the barrel rusted, but if you ask the curator, they'll tell you, that rifle saved more lives than it ever took. And behind it stood a man of conviction. The preacher's rifle, Moses' spear,